Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Trump's foreign policy could be described as doublespeak. The president doesn't have a defined policy approach. Even goals are difficult to discern. Is this what the art of the deal means? Is Trump's foreign policy making America great again and the world safer? Cross-talking Trump's foreign policy, I'm joined by my guest, Michael Vlahos in Washington. He is a professor of strategy at the Johns Hopkins University. Also in Washington, we have Daniel Faraci. He is the director of grassroots political consulting. And in New York, we cross to George Samueli. He is a fellow at the Global Policy Institute of London and author of the book Bombs for Peace. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Michael, let me go to you first in Washington. You are, after all, a professor of strategy. So, given what we have seen of this administration, well, so they say, does this president have a foreign policy strategy? Go ahead, Mr. Strategist.
Strategy can be the thing itself, or it can be a representation of the formulas and nostrums that float among the privileged ruling elites. And thus, I think you see Trump speaking to the people who most enthusiastically support him, right? His base, so-called. And he is speaking for them, as in their voice. And in that sense, much of the rhetoric and delivery of his foreign policy is really shaped to fit his constituency. And part of that is sloughing off this elaborate kabuki theater and highly choreographed ballet that marked elitist foreign policy since 1945. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that's for show, and it's very effective. Now, when it comes to the substance of his foreign policy, it also reflects his constituents. And they like the idea of America first. And of course, he uses that phrase. And so I'd call his worldview foreign policy a kind of America First version of world leadership, which may sound contradictory, but I don't think it is. Well, what it means essentially is detaching. Yeah.
I think it is.
It's detaching. Yeah.
Go ahead. Finish your thought. Go ahead. Finish your thought. No, finish your thought. Go ahead.
No, the point is, there's a whole level of spin and representation that is not necessarily moored to the actual relationships he's pursuing. So a lot of this is very self-conscious grandstanding for the domestic audience, and he's toning down the leadership end and saying, we will be world leader if it's really helps the U.S. first.
Okay, all right. I guess that's why it's so confusing to understand President Trump, George, because if we just take what Michael said there, I mean, if Trump is, representing his base, then he's betraying everything he said that he would do for the base. Okay, it looks like we're nation building in Syria, tearing up probably one of the most important non-proliferation agreements with Iran. Okay, I'll say it. I didn't like Obama's foreign policy, but I thought the Iran deal was a good deal, and it is shown to be a good deal. Why is he doing that? Is it, again, grandstanding just because Obama did it? Is that a strategy? Go ahead, George.
Well, I think his antagonism towards Obama, trying to differentiate himself from Obama, plays a part in it. But I think that Trump really has no strong views on anything. I mean, he's been on pretty much on every side of every issue throughout his long life. I mean, he's been for abortion, against abortion, for immigration, against immigration, for gun control, against gun control. So what he ran on in 2016 wasn't really his final view on anything. He found that kind of America first and a kind of quasi-isolationist policy worked for him. And it swept him to power. It probably rather surprised him that it was as successful as it was. Once he got into office, he kind of abandoned all of that. And occasionally he still comes out with his rhetoric about we've wasted $17 trillion in the Middle East, and we could have spent all this money on building roads and bridges. But he's still pursuing the same policy in the Middle East. He still comes out with the stuff that he was doing in 2016 about, well, wouldn't it be great if we got along with Russia?
Yeah.
But he hasn't done anything about it. And, he's had every opportunity since winning the election of seizing this issue and saying, hey, I ran on this platform, and this is what's going to happen. That we are going to abandon these ridiculous projects in the Middle East. We are going to try to improve relations with Russia. This is what I won the election on. But he hasn't done it. And he has sort of quite happily just gone along with the Washington swamp that he had so eloquently denounced in 2016.
Yeah, well, Daniel, and the same foreign policy swamp denounced him as candidate, okay? And I think it's pretty clear that, because his appointees are slow in coming because Congress won't vote on them, you still have these old deep state actors still there. And then on top of it, he's surrounded him with people like John Bolton and Pompeo. I mean, they have nothing to do with the vision that he presented during the campaign. Now, I will agree with George. He's flip-flopped all through his life. Go ahead, Daniel, in Washington.
Few ways to simplify things. His main foreign policy is wherever he has a personal financial interest and branding opportunity, and that's really first and foremost where his heart and soul is. And as George had articulated, this is a lifelong Democrat who turned himself into a Tea Party evangelical conservative for that 36% base to win the election, which was a 30-year record low turnout, and he did a brilliant job at it. The irony, the grand irony is now that he holds office, he has capitulated everything. There is no White House policy toward the intelligence community, the Pentagon, or state whatsoever. They're autonomous to create their own. And the one thing he stayed true on throughout that whole thing is he's like a Donald W. Obama. He is a hawkish neocon. We were going to get that whether you had Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And if you really look as to what he spoke at on the campaign trail and throughout his life, that's his ideology. So that reflects very well as to why we are where we are in Syria, why a Bolton is hired, in case negotiations don't go well in North Korea, the Iran deal. And I'm not a President Obama apologist either, but that is the one other caveat, Peter, that you pointed out. Yep. The Iran deal, TPP, Paris Climate Accord, and all negotiation for him is he pledged on the campaign trail that he wasn't Obama. He has disdain for him on behalf of his personal loyalty with the Clintons, ironically. Right. Over many years, and that guides him going the opposite way of Obama on a lot of those key issues.
Michael, one of the issues that during the campaign and after he became president is his critics would say that he would be injurious to American allies. Let's think in terms of the Middle East and NATO, right. Okay? Right. But, he's surrounded by people that are supporting policies that, in fact, do that. When we look at the Iran deal, we had Macron in Washington. Merkel is going to show up. I mean, they're advocating to keep the treaty alive, and this is really injurious to the alliance. I mean, I would like to see NATO completely dissolved and have a completely new security arrangement in Europe. I think that's what Donald Trump actually was thinking about during the campaign. So, I mean, the outside world must be looking. I know they are looking at him in bewilderment because. Where is he going to go next? I mean, the attack on Syria recently, that was against international law. The whole world looks at it that way, not the foreign policy blob in Washington. They've probably never heard of international law. Go ahead, Michael.
I think that the U.S. presidency for some time, maybe 30, 40 years, has been captured by the sort of set relationships that it has to have. And in many ways, the dependent countries of NATO, even the great powers like France, Germany, and Britain, are essentially pulling the strings. And I think part of Trump's approach was to put them in a situation where they felt less secure about the relationship, and thus would be more pliant and more willing to come to Mr. Trump. And that seems to have worked.
Yes, amazingly.
Just as his blustering, and it seems to have created the movement in North Korea. Neither Germany, certainly not Britain, and France either, are willing to step up and take over the defense of their realm. And they are not merely dependent on the U.S., but they've grown needy. And so the U.S. doesn't want to be in a position where it has to jump every time NATO gets a twitch. And so what he's doing is redefining the strength of the U.S. in the alliance without overcommitting. And also, this kind of representation speaks well with his base, and they're excited because the U.S. is acting like the great power that it was meant to be.
Let me ask you. But this paradigm here, does it actually make America more solid in the alliance, and does it make the alliance more solid? Because what we have here is a moral hazard. Okay, they're not. The Europeans are. They say they're going to spend money and all that, but they're just going to look to Washington for their defense. And you have a president who's actually quite skeptical about all of these things. I mean, that's kind of a very dangerous thing to be in, okay? Because the European NATO allies are like drug addicts. They keep going to Washington to get their next fix. I'll give you the last 20. I'll give you the last 20 seconds in this part. Go ahead, and Michael, go ahead.
The U.S. is in a stronger position, and the word injurious that you brought up is only relevant, I think, if there actually is a threat to NATO. And with Angela on the horn with Mr. Putin all the time, I don't really see the great crisis, especially now that the U.S. has backed off a little from Ukraine. That was the great danger. And
well, Michael,
let me jump a problem in. There. I see more of.
Let me jump in here. We're going to go to a break. We're going to talk a lot about Ukraine in May. Mark my words here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on Trump's foreign policy. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing Trump's foreign policy. Let me go back to George in New York. An interesting thing happened with this Macron visit, and when we have Theresa May in her domestic crises at home. I'm thinking of the Salisbury alleged chemical weapons attack. Then we had the attack on Syria, and it really is interesting to me how they talk about Syria now. We had Macron. He said France and the U.S. and allies to quote, build Syria of tomorrow. Oh, by the way, the United States is making it illegal for other countries and companies to actually help Syria rebuild. It can't be in the part of Syria where the domestic government has control. So, George, it's about exactly 100 years ago, we had Sykes-Picot redrawing the Middle East. It seems like imperial habits die really hard. And on top of that, don't you think France, the United States, and its allies have, quote, helped the Syrian people enough? Go ahead, George.
That's exactly right. It was hilarious listening to Macron discussing Syria and this role that the France was going to play in Syria, that doesn't even realize that a few days earlier, the Syrians were celebrating a day of independence. Independence when France evacuated Syria. That's what the Syrians were celebrating, the departure of the French. The idea that they are now going to be welcoming their former colonial masters with open arms is laughable. But I do think that the American, French, British policy in Syria is actually rather dangerous, because while they have no real prospect of winning, because they don't have any likely candidate who can form any sort of a government in Syria. What they can do is to prevent any kind of a settlement in Syria. And I think that's really what they're going to try and do, and which is to prevent any kind of consolidation of Syrian government control. Because all the various candidates, I mean, the Americans' proposal for the SDF, which is largely Kurdish, that's not no-go because the Turks don't want them, and the Syrians are not going to accept Kurdish rule, and so that's out. So what they're going to try and do is, I think, keep the war going largely by feeding again the various jihadis. And therefore just prevent what they see as Russian consolidation in Syria. And I think that's, a danger. And I do think that Ukraine is also a danger. I think that
yes, I do too.
There are still very powerful forces within Washington, notably the John Boltons and Pompeos, who want to stir up Ukraine and relaunch some kind of a war there.
Well, and we go to Daniel. There's see, Western mainstream media doesn't take any interest in these things, but I'm a lot closer to this situation, and things are getting to a boiling point in Ukraine. That's why May is going to be a very hot month. Oh, right before FIFA, the World Cup in Moscow. I'm sure there's no connection there. Okay, and Daniel, I mean, looking at Syria, we can talk a little bit maybe about Ukraine some more later, but you have this flip-flopping going back and forth, and I'm going to agree with Michael. I think that Trump is really expressing the views of his base. So they don't like these foreign entanglements, these interventions, and the terrible waste of money when he wants to get an investment bill passed in the United States, which desperately needs an improvement in infrastructure here. So, I mean, he seems to want it to have both ways, but he can't have both. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, and tweets and rhetoric, aside from policy, is always something to decipher with this president. But I disagree with both of you a little bit on a few points. One, on NATO, there's not this grand re-scheme where France and Germany and everyone are in love with us over NATO and are going to reach their commitments. And in fact, our commitment of 2% is bogus because we don't even count Iraq or Afghanistan intervention in our NATO estimates. And if we really included things properly, there would be a little more of a balance. But none of that has worked out. And also backing off of Ukraine, I guess I'm agreeing with you, Peter, and disagreeing with Michael a bit. We did not back off of Ukraine whatsoever. And I have spoken on this program many times on the proxy war with Ukraine and with Syria and sanctions that are meant as part of a geopolitical bipolar scheme of ours with China and South Korea to counter Russia on natural resources in the Arctic. And we're trying to bankrupt Russia from being able to develop up there. And in fact, over the last 2 weeks, I mean, I get new news on that all the time where we're demanding that the waterway be open for international development and traffic, as well as what we're doing in Syria to continue to back jihadis, allow the Turks to do what they're doing in the north, working with Europe and now encouraging the Gulf to come in and develop and basically take over northern Syria. Trump spoke with Macron and basically talked about how it was ours and our territory to prevent Iran from expanding to the Mediterranean.
And that's why I mentioned Sykes-Picot, because that was a partition, and this is what they want to do is another partition here.
Yes.
Michael, one of the things that's happened in the last week or so...
Can I jump one...
You want to finish your point? Go ahead. Go ahead, Daniel, finish your point.
Yeah, I was going to say one final point. Non-intervention is not Trump's base. Trump's base, that Tea Party 36%, are all neocons and hawks as well of the baby boomer generation. So while that rhetoric sometimes works, because that might be what Trump is thinking for the minute or not, they are the John Boltons and Mike Pompeos. That type of intervention is what they've always supported.
Daniel, there was a really interesting post-mortem of the 2016 election, and there is evidence, very strong evidence, that a number of counties were flipped because of the anti-war sentiment. That they were Democrats, but they actually supported Trump's non-interventionist view. So I would differ with that. Michael, I have a kind of a much bigger question to ask you. Over the last week or so, we've heard these murmurings that France and the United States and Great Britain want to start going around the Security Council at the United Nations so they can pursue their Syria policy. I find this really very troublesome and dangerous here, because we have to remember what the Security Council was established for in the first place. It was to make sure there would never be another third world war. And now these major powers, we're talking in like 19th century terms again. These great powers, they don't want to use international institutions. They abhor international law, or they're just above it. That is very dangerous, because as dysfunctional as the UN is, the United Nations Security Council actually works the way it's supposed to, where you don't have a coalition of great powers that brush aside the concerns of others here. I find it truly disturbing, and it's the same powers exactly 100 years later that carved up the Middle East, and they want to do it again. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, the U.S. is in a difficult position, I think, of trying to restrain developments that could really upend world, I don't know, stability, peace, whatever you want to call a non-ideal situation that's still better than the worst. And this kind of pushing locally is what Israel and Saudi Arabia are doing vis-a-vis Iran. You see that in Qatar. And then also what you mentioned, the meddling of Britain and France, which have been doing it in Syria for 250 years. And of course, when I talked about the U.S. aggressiveness in Ukraine, I was referring to Secretary of State Clinton. And I think the U.S. needs to pull back enough with the positive effect of seeing to meet the needs of the base, reining in the neocons who are not yet completely in control, and not pursuing policies that will inevitably lead to war, while at the same time looking strong. So this, I think, brings us to the nub of the current vector of Mr. Trump, which is to make a deal with Korea, which is outside of the realms that we've been talking about. Right. And that would give his administration a sufficient authority then to more effectively rein in the Israel, Britain, France, Saudi Arabias that are causing all sorts of pesky problems, and might create a basis for coming to some kind of agreement with Mr. Putin in the future. And that the vehicle for that, the framework for that, has not been established. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean it cannot be established. So it's a very fine line, I think, the president is trying to follow.
Well, there's so many opportunities that are being squandered left and right. That's what makes this such a dangerous and tragic time. You know, George, let's look at the reputational issue here. I've said it many times in this program here. Trump wants to tear up the Iran deal while he wants to make a deal with the Koreans. I mean, that's kind of odd, because then the next administration comes in and they're going to renege as well. I mean, the United States puts itself in such an awkward, hypocritical position by doing that. Particularly, again, I don't like giving credit to Barack Obama. I really don't. But this was a good deal, okay? And I'd like to correct the President of the United States. All that money that they got, it was their money. It was their assets. It wasn't a gift, everybody. Then it was also an arms deal that didn't completely go through in the 1970s, $400 million, and they had to pay interest on it. So no, there was no gift to Iran. Go ahead, George. Reputation issue.
Of course. Yes. Of course, absolutely correct. And that's the whole point. I mean, that it's very hard to see how any kind of an agreement is possible in North Korea, because the North Korean leaders would be absolutely insane to give up their nuclear capability in return for what? In return for an empty American promise that we won't attack you? Why would anyone want to believe that? Once Trump goes, the next president, whether it's Pence or Nikki Haley, will immediately go back on that agreement and will indeed attack North Korea. So it would be an absolutely insane policy to go for. Just going back to what you were saying, Pete, about this going to the United Nations General Assembly. I mean, it's so hilarious, because the only power that has actually acted in accordance with international law on Syria has been Russia.
Yep.
Russia is in Syria in accordance with international law,
George,
which is at the request
George, let me jump
of
in
the
here.
legitimate government
Let me jump
of
in
Syria.
here. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. I hope I never will ever say President Nikki Haley. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.